Desperate widow cried, "Let me bury her alone." The Comanche grabbed the shovel and shocked everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the dusty plains of western Texas. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and the dry, crackling heat of late summer. A lone woman stood beside a fresh grave, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders trembling with grief. Her husband had died just hours ago, a victim of a brutal illness that had swept through their small homestead. The harshness of the frontier had claimed another soul, and now she was left to bury him alone. She clutched a worn shovel in her hands, the weight of it heavy with the burden of her sorrow. The small, barren patch of land where her husband's body lay was surrounded by nothing but the vast emptiness of the desert. There was no one to help, no one to comfort her. She wanted this final moment to be hers, to mourn in solitude. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone witnessing her heartbreak, so she cried out in desperation, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Let me bury him alone." Her words were carried away by the wind, lost in the vastness of the land. But little did she know, her plea would not go unanswered. From the shadows of the nearby trees, a lone rider watched her. His face was hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat, but his sharp eyes had been following her for some time. He was a Comanche warrior, known for his skills in battle and his silent, watchful nature. He had seen her grief from afar, and, though he was a stranger, something stirred within him. Perhaps it was the weight of his own past that drew him to her side, or perhaps it was the honor that came with protecting those who were vulnerable. Without a word, he spurred his horse forward, the rhythmic pounding of hooves cutting through the silence. As he drew closer, the woman looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. She instinctively stepped back, clutching the shovel tighter, ready to defend herself. The warrior, however, did not come to harm her. Instead, he dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached for the shovel, his strong hands wrapping around the worn handle. Without a word, he took it from her grasp and began to dig. Shocked, the woman stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to make of this unexpected act. The warrior's presence was imposing, his silence deafening, but there was something about the way he moved that made her feel oddly safe. As the shovel dug into the earth, she couldn't help but watch, torn between anger and gratitude. She had asked for solitude, but now, in this strange and unexpected moment, she realized she was not alone. The Comanche warrior was here, digging the grave with the same quiet determination that had carried him through countless battles. In that moment, the weight of her grief began to lift, just a little. The warrior's actions spoke louder than any words ever could. He wasn't here to steal or to hurt her. He was here to honor her loss, to share in her sorrow, and perhaps to remind her that even in the most desolate of places, help could still come. She stood there, watching him work, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had wanted to bury her husband alone, but this warrior, a man of few words and fewer comforts, was offering her something she hadn't expected. A quiet, respectful presence. A gesture of kindness in a world that often felt so cruel. The earth beneath them was dry and cracked, but the act of digging the grave together somehow made the land feel a little less empty. The warrior continued to dig, his movements steady and precise. The woman slowly lowered herself to the ground, her hands trembling as she sat beside him. She had been ready to face the pain alone, but in this unexpected moment, she realized that perhaps, just perhaps, she didn't have to. The Comanche warrior had shocked everyone, not with violence, but with an act of simple, profound kindness. The warrior continued to dig without hesitation, his movements deliberate and steady. The widow, still taken aback by his unexpected presence, watched him in silence, unable to comprehend the depth of this stranger's actions. He did not ask for permission, nor did he speak. He simply worked, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to help a grieving woman bury her husband. The air around them felt heavy with the weight of both sorrow and uncertainty. As the warrior dug deeper into the dry Texas earth, the widow's mind raced. She had wanted to bury her husband alone, but now she was forced to confront her own feelings of isolation and vulnerability. She had spent so much time in this harsh, unforgiving land, alone with her pain, that the presence of another person felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. Still, as she watched the warrior's back, the rhythmic sound of the shovel scraping against the soil, she began to feel a strange sense of comfort. This man, this warrior from a world she knew nothing about, was giving her something she hadn't realized she needed. Help. The grief she had been carrying alone for so long began to feel a little lighter. She had not asked for help, but here it was. Slowly, she moved closer, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears from her eyes. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a flicker of gratitude towards this silent stranger. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The woman stood for a moment, watching the warrior work, and then she knelt beside him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The warrior paused for a moment, his hand still resting on the shovel. He did not look at her, but his voice, when it came, was calm and steady. "It is what my people do," he said simply. "We help those in need." The woman didn't know what to say. She had heard stories of the Comanche warriors, of their fierce battles and their relentless pursuit of survival. She had heard of their reputation for being ruthless, but she had never heard of them offering help to anyone. It was a strange thing for her to understand, but she couldn't deny the quiet power in his words. There was a certain peace in the way he spoke, as if this was just another part of his life, as natural as the rising of the sun. As the warrior resumed his digging, the woman stood up and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the grave, now halfway dug, and felt a strange sense of closure. Her husband was not yet buried, but there was something about the warrior's presence that made it feel less like a final goodbye and more like the beginning of a new chapter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. The warrior finished digging the grave and stood up, his back straight and his eyes scanning the horizon. The widow stepped forward, her breath catching in her chest. "You've helped me more than you know," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. The warrior nodded but did not speak. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small pouch. He handed it to the widow, and she took it with trembling hands. "This is for your husband," he said quietly. Inside the pouch was a small bundle of herbs, wrapped in leather. The woman looked at him in confusion. "What is it?" she asked. The warrior's eyes softened as he explained, "It is a gift for the spirit, a blessing for the journey." The widow's eyes welled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She had not known this man, and yet, in his own quiet way, he had given her something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. A sense of peace, a reminder that there was still kindness in the world, even in the most unexpected of places. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land, the widow felt a deep sense of connection to the warrior, to the land, and to the man she had loved and lost. She would bury him in this lonely patch of earth, but she would carry his memory with her, forever. And, for the first time since his death, she felt like she was not truly alone. As the final rays of sunlight faded behind the horizon, the widow stood by her husband's grave, feeling a mixture of peace and emptiness settle in her chest. The warrior had finished his task and stepped back, his work done. He hadn't spoken much, but his actions had spoken volumes. For the first time in days, she felt like her sorrow was shared. She wiped her eyes, the dust and grief from the past few days finally beginning to clear. As the warrior mounted his horse, ready to leave, she felt a twinge of hesitation. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but there was one thing she needed to ask him before he left. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice stronger now, no longer trembling with the rawness of her earlier pain. The warrior paused, looking over his shoulder at her. His face remained unreadable, but his dark eyes softened as they met hers. "I have seen loss," he said simply, his voice calm, yet full of depth. "And I have learned that no one should bury their sorrow alone." With those words, he nudged his horse forward, his silhouette disappearing into the twilight. The widow stood there, watching him go, feeling the weight of his words sink deep into her heart. In that moment, She realized that her grief had not only been for her husband, but for the life she had lost in this harsh, unforgiving land. The warrior had given her something she hadn't known she needed, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there could be acts of kindness, even from the most unexpected places. The next few days were a blur of quiet reflection. The widow spent her time at her husband's grave, thinking about the past, about what had brought her here, and about the future. She had always been a woman of independence, accustomed to working the land and taking care of herself. But now, for the first time, she felt vulnerable, exposed. She had no one, no family, no community. Her neighbors had long since stopped coming around, leaving her to fend for herself in the desolation of the Texas plains. It was a life she had chosen, once, but now it felt as if it was a life she had been trapped in. The quiet days passed, and the widow found herself thinking more and more about the warrior, the Comanche who had come to her aid. Who was he? What was his story? Why had he been there at that moment, when she had needed someone the most? She wondered if he would return, but she also knew better than to expect such things. The Comanche were not a people who formed bonds with outsiders. They were warriors, protectors of their own. Yet, something in the way he had spoken to her, something in his quiet strength, made her feel as if there was more to him than the reputation of the fierce, untouchable warrior. Days turned into weeks, and the widow resumed her solitary life. She worked the land, fixed the roof of the small cabin she had shared with her husband, and did what she could to keep herself busy. But there was an emptiness now, a hollow space where her husband's presence once filled the air. One afternoon, as she walked back from the river with a bucket of water, she spotted something in the distance. A rider. The silhouette was unmistakable. It was him, the Comanche warrior. He was riding toward her cabin, slowly and without haste. Her heart skipped a beat. She had not expected him to return. But here he was, as silent and calm as ever, his presence filling the space between them like a storm that had not yet broken. The widow froze, unsure of what to do. Her first instinct was to turn and run, but she stayed where she was, watching him approach. He stopped his horse a few paces from her, looking down at her with that same unreadable gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in leather. "I brought you this," he said, his voice low and steady. The widow stepped forward, her curiosity piqued. The bundle was small, wrapped tightly, but she could see the intricacy of the design, symbols and beads of some kind. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and took it from his hands. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The warrior's eyes softened. "It is a gift for your journey," he said. "For strength." She untied the leather straps carefully, revealing a necklace made of small, polished stones, each one strung together with fine leather. It was beautiful in its simplicity, the colors deep and earthy. It felt like something sacred. She looked up at him, her heart full of unspoken words. The warrior didn't stay long. After giving her the gift, he mounted his horse once more, giving her one last nod before he turned, and rode away, disappearing into the vast, empty land. The widow stood there, holding the necklace in her hands, the weight of it grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She felt as if the warrior had given her more than just an item. He had given her hope. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt a sense of connection to something bigger than her own grief, something ancient and strong. She felt the weight of the land, the history of it, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might be able to survive this. Not just survive, but live again. The days following the warrior's departure passed in a blur, each one blending into the next with little change. The widow, still holding the necklace he had given her, found herself wearing it every day. The small, polished stones seemed to carry with them a quiet strength, and every time she touched them, she felt as if they were a reminder that she was not truly alone. It was strange how a single gesture from a stranger could stir something deep inside her. She had lived her life fiercely independent, unwilling to rely on anyone, but now she found herself looking toward the horizon, wondering if the warrior would return. The world around her seemed unchanged, the dry, unforgiving land, the empty horizon stretching out before her. But there was something new in her heart, something that made the emptiness feel a little less consuming. As the widow continued with her daily tasks, The heavy burden of grief slowly began to lift, though it remained present, always there in the background. The work she had once done with a sense of dread, tending to the garden, fixing the roof, gathering firewood, no longer seemed as daunting. Each day, she found herself moving with more purpose, a small but steady sense of renewal growing in her spirit. Weeks passed, and with the change in seasons came the first hints of cooler weather. The widow could feel the shift in the air. The mornings were crisp now, and the long, harsh summer had finally given way to the quieter, cooler days of autumn. The wind, once hot and relentless, now carried a gentle chill that seemed to soothe her. One morning, as she was walking toward the barn with a bucket of grain for the horses, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching. Her heart quickened, a flutter of anticipation rising in her chest. She turned to see a rider on horseback coming toward her. As he drew closer, the widow's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the Comanche warrior. He was riding slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, his gaze fixed on her. The widow felt her pulse race as the familiar presence of the warrior filled the space between them. He stopped his horse in front of her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, before he finally dismounted. "You are well?" he asked, his voice calm, though there was a certain softness to it that she hadn't heard before. The widow nodded, unable to find the words to express what she felt. She was surprised to see him again, but also, somehow, comforted. "I am," she replied simply. He studied her for a moment, as if he was weighing something in his mind. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice low. "The land is harsh, and it is easy to become lost in it. But I believe you are strong." The widow looked at him, her chest tightening with emotion. She had never been good at expressing vulnerability, but something in his words made her feel seen, understood in a way she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you," she said softly. The warrior nodded once, his dark eyes locking with hers. "You are not alone," he added, as if reading the thoughts in her mind. "Not in this land, and not in your grief. I have seen much loss. It is part of life, but it does not define us." His words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep within her. She had spent so much time believing that her grief was something she had to carry alone, that she had to face the world by herself. But in that moment, standing in front of this quiet warrior, she realized that maybe there was another way. Maybe the weight of loss could be shared. The warrior reached into his saddlebag once more, and the widow's eyes followed his movements. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth and handed it to her. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small, hand-carved wooden figurine. It was a bear, intricately detailed, with fierce eyes and powerful limbs. "This is for you," the warrior said quietly. A reminder of strength. The bear endures, even when the world is harsh. The widow took the figurine, her hands trembling as she held it in her palm. It was beautiful, and something about it felt sacred. She looked up at the warrior, her heart full of unspoken words. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice breaking. The warrior said nothing, but his gaze softened. He placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity, and for a moment, they stood there together, the world quiet around them. The widow realized that, in that brief moment, she had begun to heal, not because her grief was gone, but because she had allowed herself to accept help, to allow someone in. The warrior mounted his horse again, preparing to leave, but before he did, he gave her one last look. "You are not alone," he repeated, his words lingering in the air. And with that, he turned and rode off, disappearing into the vast expanse of the plains. The widow stood there for a long while, her fingers still wrapped around the wooden bear. She had never expected this kind of comfort, this quiet presence of a stranger who understood more than he let on. She hadn't asked for it, but somehow, it had come to her. And for the first time since her husband's death, she felt a sense of peace begin to settle over her heart. She was not alone, and she would survive. She would live again. The days continued to pass slowly in the widow's life. The change in seasons brought with it a new sense of calm, but it also brought a lingering uncertainty. The winds had begun to cool, and the early signs of winter could be felt in the mornings. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the land, as if the earth itself was preparing for a time of rest. The widow, too, found herself contemplating a kind of rest, a rest from the overwhelming grief that had consumed her since her husband's death. The warrior had left her with a gift, a reminder of strength. The carved bear sat on the small wooden table beside her bed, its presence offering a quiet sense of comfort. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded of his words. The bear endures, even when the world is harsh. It was a small thing, but it carried weight. For the first time in months, she found herself smiling. The warrior had given her more than just a figurine. He had given her permission to endure, to keep moving forward. The days were now filled with more purpose. She no longer spent all her time in mourning, but slowly, steadily, began to take back some control over her life. She spent more time at the garden, tending to the small plot of land that her husband had worked so hard to cultivate. Each plant that grew, each small harvest she brought in, felt like a small victory. She still missed her husband, of course. The empty spaces in her cabin, the absence of his voice, would never be filled. But she had begun to learn how to live without him. The land had always been unforgiving, and now, it felt as if it was testing her once again. The nights grew colder, and there were times when she felt completely alone. But she had learned to embrace that solitude, to find strength in it. She had to. There was no other choice. One afternoon, as the widow was working outside, gathering firewood for the approaching winter, she noticed a figure on horseback in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the warrior again. He rode slowly toward her, his silhouette against the setting sun, almost like a shadow coming to life. The widow's heart raced in her chest. She had not expected to see him again, but here he was, just as he had been before. The warrior dismounted once he was close, his eyes never leaving hers. His face was as unreadable as it had always been, but there was a softness to his gaze, a gentleness that had not been there before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The widow stood still, holding the firewood in her arms, unsure of what to say. It had been weeks since they last spoke, and now, the silence between them seemed more powerful than ever. Finally, the warrior broke the stillness. "How are you?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of concern. The widow nodded, looking down at the firewood in her arms. "I am well," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. "The land is still harsh, but I am managing." The warrior nodded, as if he understood. "It is a harsh place," he said, "but you are strong. I see that now." The widow looked up at him, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Relief? It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in a long time. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The warrior's gaze softened even more, and for the first time, he gave her a small smile. "You do not need to thank me," he said. "It is not kindness if it is expected." His words caught the widow off guard. She had grown accustomed to relying on herself, to doing everything alone. But now, in this moment, she realized that kindness did not have to come from within her. It could come from others, too. And maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of receiving it. The warrior reached into his saddlebag, pulling out something wrapped in leather. The widow's eyes widened slightly. Was it another gift? He handed it to her wordlessly. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small, intricate knife. The handle was carved with symbols, and the blade, though worn, was sharp and sturdy. "It is for protection," the warrior said, "for when you are alone." The widow felt the weight of the knife in her hand, its purpose clear. She had never been one to rely on weapons, but there was something about this knife, about the gesture, that made her feel safer, more in control. "Thank you," she said again, her voice soft but full of emotion. The warrior simply nodded, his expression unreadable once more. "You are not truly alone," he said quietly. "The land may be empty, but it is not without purpose. You have strength within you, as much as anyone else." The widow didn't know what to say. His words struck her deeply, and for a moment, she simply stood there, holding the knife in her hands, feeling a sense of connection to him that went beyond words. The warrior mounted his horse once more, preparing to leave. "Take care," he said, his voice steady. And with that, he turned and rode off, leaving her standing there, the knife in her hand, the weight of his words in her heart. The widow watched him disappear into the distance, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and peace. She was not alone. Not anymore. The winter winds began to bite at the widow's cabin as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. The once vibrant landscape of Texas now seemed draped in a quiet, muted blanket of snow. The hard, barren land she had once known as unforgiving now lay in peaceful stillness, a calmness that contrasted sharply with the turmoil in her heart. The Comanche warrior's gift, the small knife, rested by her bedside, a constant reminder of the bond that had begun to form between them, though it was still an unfamiliar, unspoken connection. She had begun to wear it at her side whenever she worked, feeling the cool weight of it against her waist, a silent comfort in an uncertain world. Every evening, as she sat by the fire, she found herself thinking of him, of his quiet presence and the strength he had shown. There had been times when she considered leaving the land behind and starting anew. She had no family here, no roots that tied her to this place. The hardships of life on the frontier were enough to drive anyone away. But something kept her rooted to this land, something beyond the grief of losing her husband, beyond the struggles of daily survival. Perhaps it was the memories, or perhaps it was the silent promise the warrior had made. The winter had tested her, but it had also shown her how much she had changed. The nights were longer now, and she would often find herself staring out into the vast, dark horizon, wondering if he would come again. She hadn't asked for his help, but he had given it nonetheless. She didn't know what it meant, what it would lead to, but it felt as though their paths were meant to cross again. As the days passed, her solitude no longer felt as oppressive as it once had. She had learned to embrace it, to find strength in the quiet moments between her work, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the crackling of the fire. But one afternoon, as she tended to her garden, gathering the last of the herbs before the cold completely set in, she saw him again. The warrior appeared on the horizon, his figure cutting through the snow, his steady, purposeful pace matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. She had not expected him, yet here he was, returning as he had promised. He rode closer, his presence as commanding as ever, yet now there was a familiarity in his movements, as if he had always been a part of the land, part of her life. As he dismounted, the widow stood still, unable to move for a moment. "I return," he said simply, his deep voice carrying through the still air. "I wanted to see how you are." The widow nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "I am well," she replied, though her words felt inadequate in the face of his presence. She looked down at the ground for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I have learned much since we last spoke." The warrior studied her, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "And what have you learned?" he asked, his voice soft, but with a firmness that made her feel seen, understood. She paused, considering his question. "I have learned that I do not have to be alone," she said quietly. "I have learned that there is strength in accepting help." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Strength comes in many forms," he said. "It is not just the strength to endure, but the strength to accept the help of others when it is offered. It is the strength to allow others to carry part of the burden." His words struck a chord deep within her. She had spent so long believing that she had to carry the weight of the world on her own, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But now, with him standing before her, she realized how wrong she had been. "You have helped me," she said, her voice full of gratitude, "in ways I cannot fully explain." The warrior's gaze softened, and he gave her a slight nod. "You have helped yourself," he said simply, "and that is the greatest strength of all." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out another small bundle, handing it to her. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a simple yet finely crafted leather pouch. Inside, there was a small bundle of herbs and dried flowers, a mixture of things she recognized as part of his people's healing rituals. "This is for you," he said, "for strength in body and spirit." She took the pouch, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. He nodded once more, turning to mount his horse. "I will leave now," he said. "But remember, you are never truly alone. The land, the people, there is always someone who will see you through." The widow watched as he rode away, his silhouette growing smaller against the snowy horizon. She stood there for a long time, the weight of his words sinking deep into her heart. She was not alone, and in that moment, she realized that perhaps the greatest gift he had given her was not just the strength to endure, but the understanding that help, kindness, and connection were not signs of weakness, but of true strength. As the last traces of the warrior's presence faded into the distance, the widow felt something stir inside her. The journey ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer afraid of facing it alone. She had the strength to carry on, and now, she knew she had the strength to ask for help when she needed it. The widow spent the following weeks in quiet contemplation, the lessons she had learned from the warrior weighing heavily on her heart. She had never been one to rely on others, but now, she was starting to understand the importance of connection and trust. The small leather pouch of herbs and dried flowers he had given her remained beside her bed, a constant reminder that she was not alone in this harsh, unforgiving land. The cold weather had not been easy to endure. The Texas winters were biting, and the wind seemed to cut through everything, turning the land into a frozen wasteland. But despite the chill, she found herself working with more purpose. The winter had taken its toll on the land, but she was determined to continue. She cleared snow from the roof of her cabin, chopped wood for the fire, and tended to the animals with the same diligence as before. Yet, something had shifted inside her. She no longer did these things out of necessity alone, but out of a quiet sense of responsibility to herself. She had learned to embrace the solitude of the land, but now, in her heart, there was a place for something more. A sense of belonging, a connection to the world outside her cabin, had begun to grow. One evening, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, she sat with the small knife the warrior had given her. It was still sharp and well-maintained, and she ran her fingers over the smooth, carved handle, thinking about him. The warrior had come into her life when she was at her lowest, and although she had not asked for his help, he had shown her something important, that sometimes we must accept help from others to heal. She had not seen him in weeks, and she wondered where he was, if he was still out there. Was he still watching over her, as he had promised? The thought of him made her heart ache, though she couldn't explain why. She had not formed any expectations, yet the bond they shared felt real, if unspoken. The door to her cabin creaked open, and she turned, startled. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the outside world. The widow's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him, the Comanche warrior. He had returned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The warrior stood silently in the doorway, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. The widow's breath caught in her chest, her heart pounding as the memories of their last meeting flooded her mind. His presence filled the room, as steady and unshakable as the land itself. He stepped forward, closing the door behind him, and for the first time, she noticed the weariness in his eyes. His usual calm and confident demeanor seemed slightly diminished, as if he had been through something difficult. "I have returned," he said, his voice low but steady. "I had to see you again." The widow stood slowly, unsure of what to say. I'm glad you're here," she said softly, her voice tinged with surprise. She hadn't expected him to come back, not after all this time. "Are you well?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any sign of what might have brought him back. The warrior nodded, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes that made her wonder. "The land is harsh," he said simply, "but I have learned much in my travels." His words were vague, and the widow didn't press him for more details. She had learned not to pry, especially with someone like him, a man who kept his thoughts close. The warrior stepped further into the room, glancing at the fire before meeting her eyes once more. "I wanted to bring something to you," he said. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, the widow's breath caught. It was a finely crafted bow, long and sturdy, with intricate designs carved along the wooden shaft. She had never seen a weapon like it, and the craftsmanship was nothing short of impressive. "It is for you," he said, his voice soft. "A gift to protect yourself. The land is growing colder, and there are many dangers lurking in the shadows." The widow took the bow in her hands, feeling its weight. The feel of it in her hands was grounding, the leather grip strong and familiar. It was a symbol of the warrior's care, a way for her to protect herself, just as he had taught her to protect her spirit. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. The warrior watched her for a moment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "The land is not forgiving," he said quietly, "but neither are you. You will survive, because you carry strength within you." The widow felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had never allowed herself to believe in her own strength, but now, with the warrior standing before her, She began to realize that he had seen something in her that she hadn't yet seen in herself. "I will survive," she echoed, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I will carry on, for as long as I can." The warrior nodded once, his expression unreadable. He turned to leave, but before he did, he paused in the doorway. "You are not alone," he said softly. And with that, he was gone. The widow stood there for a long time, the bow still in her hands. His words echoed in her mind. "You are not alone." For the first time in a long time, she realized that he was right. She wasn't alone, not anymore. The days grew shorter as winter took hold of the land. The widow, now more attuned to the rhythms of the harsh Texas landscape, found herself adapting to the season's demands with quiet strength. The bow the warrior had gifted her hung in the corner of her cabin, a constant reminder that she was not only capable of surviving this unforgiving land, but that she was no longer the woman she had been when her husband died. She had changed in ways she could not yet fully understand, but there was no doubt that she had begun to accept the reality of her new life. Every day brought new challenges, but with each one, she grew more certain of her ability to face them head-on. The Comanche warrior had not returned, and though she had expected his visits to become regular, she had come to terms with the fact that his life and hers were very different. He was a wanderer by nature, a man bound to the wilderness, while she was bound to the land that had taken so much from her. Yet, the connection they had shared, silent but powerful, remained. One evening, as she sat by the fire, her mind wandered to thoughts of him again. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, and whether he thought of her as often as she thought of him. The bow, now well worn from use, rested against the wall as if waiting for something. She had begun to trust it, the way it fit in her hands, the way the string felt when she pulled it taut. Her confidence had grown, and with that, she no longer feared the land or what it might bring. The world outside her cabin had become a place she could navigate, not with dread but with determination. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin's old wood. It was a typical winter night, the kind she had grown used to, but tonight there was something different in the air. She didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was the silence. Or perhaps it was the lingering thought that she had yet to fully accept the truth of her life now. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. She stood up, a sudden surge of anticipation filling her chest. Was it him? Her breath caught as she peered through the frosted window, the faint outline of a rider emerging from the snowstorm. As the figure drew closer, her heart beat faster, hope and curiosity mixing in her chest. It was him, the warrior. He was back. His silhouette against the snow was like a shadow come to life, and as he neared the cabin, she opened the door without a second thought. He dismounted from his horse, his eyes meeting hers with the same quiet strength as before. There was no greeting, no words exchanged at first. It was as if their bond, so quietly forged, required no explanation. He was simply there, and that was enough. "I have returned," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of the winter seemed to rest on his shoulders. "The land has many paths, but sometimes, the journey brings me back to places I didn't expect." The widow nodded, her heart filled with gratitude. "I didn't expect this," she said softly, her voice laced with emotion. "I didn't expect you to come back." The warrior stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You are stronger than you know," he said, as if he could see something in her she hadn't yet recognized in herself. "But you do not have to be alone." His words struck her deeply, more than she could explain. She had always prided herself on her independence, but in that moment, she realized how much she had longed for someone to understand her, to see her. The warrior's return was more than just a visit. It was a reaffirmation that she had not been abandoned. She had not been left to face this harsh world alone. The warrior reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The widow's heart skipped a beat. What was it this time? As he unwrapped it, she saw that it was a finely crafted necklace, with beads of stone and bone. It was beautiful, each bead intricately carved and polished. The necklace was clearly made with care, and she could see that it was a gift meant to honor her strength. "This is for you," he said softly. "A reminder that you are never alone. That even in the harshest times, there are those who see your struggle." The widow took the necklace in her hands, her fingers tracing the smooth beads. She could feel the power in the gift, in the simple act of offering it to her. She had never expected such a gesture, and yet, it touched her in a way she could not explain. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've given me." The warrior nodded, his gaze softening. "There is no need for thanks. It is enough to see you stand strong." He paused for a moment, then added, "But remember, you do not have to carry this burden alone. There are always paths, always choices. And sometimes, the choice is to walk alongside someone." The widow stood silently, the weight of his words sinking in. She had never considered that she could choose to walk beside someone, rather than carrying everything alone. She had been so focused on surviving, on doing everything herself, that she had never allowed herself to truly consider what it might be like to share her journey. "I think I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady now. "I don't have to be alone." The warrior nodded, his face unreadable once more. "No, you are not alone." As the night deepened, the two of them sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames a stark contrast to the cold outside. And for the first time in a long time, the widow felt the weight of her grief eased just a little. It was not gone, not completely, but it had softened. She had made room for something new, something stronger. And she knew now that, no matter what lay ahead, she would face it with the knowledge that she was never truly alone. The winter had tightened its grip on the land, but the widow's cabin had become a sanctuary against the cold. The fire in the hearth crackled warmly, its light flickering off the walls as she sat, her hands still wrapped around the necklace the warrior had given her. His visit had left her with a feeling of peace, one that had settled into her bones like the warmth from the fire. For the first time in a long time, she felt as though she was moving forward, not because she had forgotten the past, but because she had learned to carry it with her and accept the help that came her way. The necklace had become a part of her daily life, and whenever she felt doubt creeping in, her fingers would brush over the beads, grounding her in the warrior's words. The land outside remained harsh, but she no longer felt the same isolation. The warrior's presence, though distant now, lingered in the quiet spaces of her life, like a gentle reminder that there was more to this world than hardship. One day, as she ventured into the woods to gather firewood, she came across fresh tracks in the snow. The footprints were large, spaced far apart, and she could tell immediately that they were made by a horse, not her own. Her heart skipped. Was it him again? She hadn't seen the warrior in weeks, but she recognized the sign of his arrival. She followed the tracks with cautious steps, her breath clouding in the cold air. The path led her to the clearing where she often gathered wood, and there, standing in the clearing, was the warrior, his horse grazing beside a tree. He didn't move as she approached, only turned his head to watch her. She stopped a few feet away from him, unsure of what to say. He had been absent for so long, and now, here he was again, as if the world had conspired to bring him back when she needed him most. "I see you have returned," she said softly, trying to mask the surprise in her voice. The warrior nodded, his expression unreadable as always. "The land calls me back," he replied simply. "I have traveled far, but there are always ties that pull me home." His words seemed to carry more weight now, as if they spoke of something deeper, something more personal. She found herself studying him closely, wondering if she would ever truly understand him. "I have been well," she said, breaking the silence. "The land is harsh, but I've managed." He regarded her for a moment, and then stepped forward, handing her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She took it from him with a sense of anticipation, unwrapping it to reveal another gift. This time, a finely crafted knife, its handle intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The blade was sharp and well-balanced, and the weight of it in her hands felt both powerful and reassuring. "This is for you," the warrior said, "to protect what you've built. The world is not kind, but you have found your strength. This will help you protect it." The widow stared down at the knife in her hands, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never imagined that someone, let alone a warrior she barely knew, would offer her something so meaningful, something so personal. She looked up at him, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you. I don't know how to express what this means." The warrior's eyes softened, his expression unchanged. "You don't have to express it," he said quietly. "It is not for thanks. It is for what you have earned, for the strength you have shown." He paused, taking a deep breath as if weighing his next words. You have learned to live with the land, to survive it. But it is more than survival. It is living with purpose, with meaning. I have watched you grow stronger, and I believe you will find your path forward. The widow felt a lump form in her throat as his words resonated deeply within her. She had spent so much of her life thinking that survival was enough, that enduring the hardships of the land was all that mattered. But now, standing before him, she understood that there was more to life than simply surviving. There was a way to live with purpose, to embrace the strength that came with both independence and connection. I don't know what the future holds, she said, her voice full of emotion, but I know now that I'm not alone. Not anymore. The warrior gave a slight nod, his eyes locked on hers, as if acknowledging a silent understanding. You are never truly alone, he said softly. The land is wide, but it is not empty. It is filled with those who walk it, who endure it, who share its burdens. We all walk the same path, in different ways, but we are not separate. She stood still for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. The world outside her cabin had once seemed so vast and cold, but now, it felt different. It felt like a place she could navigate, a place she could find her way through, with strength and resilience. The warrior looked toward the horizon, then back at her. I must go again, he said. But remember, there are always paths to choose, and the journey is yours to walk. With that, he turned and mounted his horse, his silhouette once again blending with the landscape. The widow watched him ride off into the distance, the same sense of peace settling over her that had filled her the last time he had left. She had not asked for any of this, and yet, it had come. The strength, the connection, the understanding. It was all part of the journey she was on. And as she turned back toward her cabin, the knife now securely at her side, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with courage, with strength, and with the knowledge that she was not truly alone. The winter had slowly begun to ease its grip on the land, though the chill still lingered in the air. The widow, now accustomed to the shifting seasons, had found a rhythm to her days. The cabin, once a place of sorrow and isolation, had transformed into a home, a place of strength, where the fire crackled warmly in the hearth and the scent of fresh bread often filled the air. She had taken the warrior's words to heart, and now, more than ever, she believed in the power of choice. Her life was hers to shape, and she had learned to trust her own strength. The knife the warrior had gifted her hung by her side, its smooth handle a constant reminder of his visit and the bond they had forged. The bow he had given her was propped against the wall near the door, a symbol of protection and readiness. It had been weeks since he had left, and although she often thought of him, she knew that his life and hers were too different for him to remain. But in the quiet moments when the wind howled outside and the snow settled on the ground, she could feel his presence, as if he had never truly left. Life on the frontier had taught her much, lessons of survival, of strength, and of resilience. But it had also taught her the importance of human connection, of not facing the world alone. As the days passed, she became more aware of the land around her, its vastness and its beauty. The prairie stretched out before her, an endless horizon that seemed both daunting and inviting. There were times when she would stand at the edge of her land and gaze out, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, but also a quiet sense of peace that came with knowing she was part of something larger. The world could be harsh, but it could also be breathtakingly beautiful. She had learned to see it with new eyes, eyes that had once been clouded by grief but were now clear with understanding. One day, as she walked toward the barn, her breath clouding in the cold air, she spotted a rider on horseback in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be him? The warrior? She watched as the figure drew closer, the familiar silhouette becoming clearer with each passing moment. And there, on horseback, was the man who had changed her life. The Comanche warrior. He had returned. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward to meet him, her heart beating faster than usual. He dismounted with the same quiet grace as always, his face unreadable, but his eyes, the eyes that had seen so much, seemed to soften as they met hers. You have returned, she said, her voice thick with emotion, though she tried to mask it. The warrior nodded, his dark eyes never leaving hers. I had to, he said simply. There are times when the path brings us back to where we belong. The widow felt a surge of gratitude, but also confusion. She had not expected him to return, and now that he had, she didn't know what to say. "I've learned much since you left," she said finally, her voice steady. "But there is still much I don't understand." The warrior regarded her for a moment, his expression still as unreadable as ever. "There is always more to learn," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We are always learning, always growing. The land teaches us, as does the heart. But the hardest lessons are the ones that come from within." His words resonated deeply with her, stirring something inside her that had been dormant for so long. She had spent so much time focusing on survival, on doing what was necessary to make it through each day, that she had never stopped to think about what she truly wanted or needed. "You have taught me much," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know how much I needed someone to show me this, to remind me that I am not alone." The warrior nodded, his gaze softening just slightly. "You are not alone," he said, his voice quieter now. "The land may be vast, and we may be but small figures in its expanse, but we are not alone. Not truly." The widow stood there for a long moment, absorbing his words. There had been so many moments when she had felt as though she was alone in the world, abandoned by fate and left to struggle against the elements. But now, standing before this warrior, this man who had taught her so much, she realized that the isolation she had felt was a choice, one that she had made out of fear, out of grief. She could choose differently now. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for everything." The warrior placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but strong. "You do not need to thank me," he said simply. "You have already done the hardest thing. You have chosen to live. And that is the greatest strength of all." The widow felt the weight of his words settle in her heart. She had chosen to live, to embrace the future, even in the face of uncertainty. She had chosen to walk forward, not because the road was easy, but because it was hers to walk. The warrior gave her a small, knowing smile before turning toward his horse. "I must go," he said softly. "But know this, you are not alone. You have made your place in this world, and that place is strong." And with that, he mounted his horse and rode off into the distance, leaving her standing in the snow, the weight of his words echoing in her heart. The widow watched him disappear into the horizon, a quiet peace settling over her. She was not alone, and for the first time in a long time, she knew that the journey ahead was hers to choose, and that whatever came next, she was ready. The winter had passed, but the land remained as unforgiving as ever. The widow stood at the edge of her property, watching the horizon where the sky met the earth, feeling the cold wind brush against her face. It had been months since the warrior had left, and while his visits had become less frequent, his presence still lingered in her life. She had grown stronger in his absence, the lessons he had taught her now ingrained in her every action. Life had become a quiet routine of working the land, maintaining the cabin, and tending to the animals. She had learned to find peace in the solitude, to embrace the stillness of the world around her. But as much as she had found strength in herself, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever see the warrior again. His words still echoed in her mind. "You are not alone. The land may be vast, but it is not empty. There are always paths, always choices." She had made those choices. She had chosen to live, to face the world head-on. But the thought of him, of the bond they had shared, still tugged at her heart. The warrior had taught her to survive, but he had also taught her to embrace the connections that life offered, to open herself to the possibility of something more. The widow had never been one to depend on anyone, but now, she found herself longing for a sense of companionship, for someone to share the journey with. One evening, as the fire flickered in the hearth, she sat by herself, lost in thought. The wind howled outside, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to dance across the walls. Her thoughts wandered back to the days when she had first met the warrior. She had been so full of grief, so overwhelmed by loss, that she hadn't realized how much of herself she had closed off. But now, looking back, she could see the subtle changes in herself, the quiet strength that had grown from the ashes of her sorrow. She had learned to accept help, to lean on others when needed. And yet, she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The next day, as the widow worked near the barn, she heard the sound of hooves in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it him? Had he returned? She looked up to see a figure approaching on horseback, the silhouette growing clearer with each passing moment. As he drew closer, she saw it was the warrior. His face, as stoic as ever, remained unchanged, but his eyes, those dark eyes that had always seen through her, seemed to soften. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and steady. "I have returned," he said quietly, his voice as familiar as the wind. The widow stood still, unsure of what to say. Part of her had believed that he would never come back, that their paths had diverged for good. But now, here he was, standing before her once more. "You came back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared speaking too loudly would shatter the moment. The warrior nodded, his gaze steady. "The land calls me back, but it also calls me forward. I have walked many paths, but some roads lead me back to those who need help. And you, widow, have learned to help yourself. But there is more for you to learn, more for you to see." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of experience, of battles fought and won, of journeys taken. The widow felt a stirring within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of hope. She had come so far since the day she buried her husband, so far from the woman who had been swallowed by grief. But now, as the warrior stood before her, she realized that there was more ahead of her, more she could become. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, unsure of where this conversation was leading. "The land is vast," he said, "but it is not the land that will shape you. It is the choices you make, the paths you walk. You have learned to survive, to live, but there is more to living than surviving. There is a way to walk with purpose, with meaning." The widow nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. She had survived, yes, but had she truly lived? She had built her life on survival, on the need to keep going, to endure the hardships. But now, for the first time, she understood that survival was not the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice soft but filled with resolve. "But I know I want to walk it with purpose. I want to find more than just survival. I want to live fully, to embrace whatever comes." The warrior looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing something new in her. "That is the first step," he said quietly. "To embrace the unknown, to walk forward even when the path is unclear." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small bundle, unwrapping it to reveal a stone. It was smooth and dark, its surface etched with patterns she didn't recognize. "This is for you," he said, placing it gently in her hand. A reminder that even when the way ahead is uncertain, there is always a way forward. The widow stared at the stone, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It was small, yet it seemed to hold something vast within it. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "I will carry it with me, always." The warrior nodded once, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned to leave. "Remember," he said quietly, "you are never truly alone. The land is vast, but the choices you make will shape the world around you." And with that, he mounted his horse and rode off into the distance, disappearing once again into the vastness of the land. The widow stood there, holding the stone in her hand, the weight of it grounding her in the present moment. She knew now that the journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers to walk. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Spring began to break the hold of winter, and the widow felt the change in the air. The days grew longer, the snow began to melt, and the once frozen ground began to thaw, revealing small green shoots pushing through the dirt. It was a reminder that life always returned, no matter how long the winter lasted. She stood outside her cabin one afternoon, looking out at the land that had become so familiar to her, the place that had seen her transformation. It had been months since the warrior had last visited, and though she had become accustomed to his absence, she couldn't deny that his presence still lingered in her thoughts. She had come to understand that his teachings were not just about surviving the land. They were about learning to live in harmony with it. The stone he had given her felt heavy in her pocket, its weight grounding her. She had kept it close ever since, and whenever doubt crept into her heart, she would feel its smooth surface and remember that even in the face of uncertainty, there was always a way forward. The quiet moments of reflection were becoming more frequent as she spent more time working the land, walking the paths of the property, and slowly rebuilding the life she had once known. She was stronger now, and with each passing day, she could feel herself becoming more resilient. The world felt less like an obstacle and more like something she could navigate. But still, she found herself looking to the horizon from time to time, wondering about the warrior, wondering if he would ever return. One evening, as the last of the sunlight faded behind the distant mountains, she heard the sound of hooves approaching. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly stepped outside, a mixture of anticipation and surprise filling her. There, riding toward her, was the warrior. His presence was as steady and commanding as it had been before, but now, there was something different about him. His face, usually unreadable, seemed softer, and there was a calmness in his eyes that spoke of journeys long traveled and battles fought, not just with others, but within himself. As he dismounted, his eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. He didn't speak immediately, but there was a silence between them that felt meaningful. Finally, he stepped forward and looked down at her, his voice steady. "I have returned, as I promised." The widow felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was as if the return of this man, this warrior, had come not just from the outside world, but from the depths of her own journey. He had helped her find a path forward, and now, here he was, returning to remind her that she wasn't alone in this life. "You've come back," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet gratitude. The warrior nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "There is always more to be done. The journey is never finished. You have grown strong, widow, but there is more strength in you than you know." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. It was as if he had seen something in her that she hadn't yet fully realized herself. She had always thought of herself as strong, but now, looking into his eyes, she wondered if she truly understood what that strength meant. "I have learned much from you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have learned that I don't have to carry everything on my own." He regarded her quietly for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It is not the burden that makes you strong, but the way you carry it," he said. "And you have learned to carry it with grace, with determination." His words sank deep into her heart. She had spent so many years carrying her grief alone, trying to survive in a world that had taken so much from her. But now, she was beginning to understand that strength didn't just come from surviving. It came from living, from choosing to stand tall in the face of adversity. "I have been afraid," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Afraid that if I open my heart, I will lose everything again." The warrior's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "Fear is a part of the journey," he said. "It will always be there, but it does not define you. It is how you choose to face it that matters." He paused, looking out at the horizon, the same vast land that had seen her through her hardest days. The land does not ask for anything, but it offers much. It offers freedom, and with that freedom comes the responsibility to live fully, without fear. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. The warrior's return had stirred something in her, something she had pushed aside for far too long. It was a reminder that life, no matter how difficult, was worth living. And with that realization, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known she needed. "I will not fear anymore," she said, her voice steady now. "I will live fully, and I will face whatever comes next with strength." The warrior gave her a small, approving nod. "That is the way forward," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You will not be alone in this. You never have been." He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and trust. "The path ahead is yours to choose, widow. And whatever road you walk, you will walk it with purpose." As he turned to leave, he looked back at her one last time. "You are not alone," he repeated, his words echoing in the quiet air. And with that, he rode off into the distance, leaving her standing there, the weight of his words lingering in her heart. The widow watched him disappear, knowing that the journey ahead, no matter how uncertain, would be hers to walk. She was ready, and she was not alone. The days grew warmer as spring settled over the land, bringing new life to the once frozen earth. The widow stood outside her cabin, taking in the sight of the green shoots sprouting from the soil and the sound of birds singing in the trees. It had been a long time since she had felt this at peace, this connected to the world around her. The fire in her hearth no longer seemed to be a necessity to keep the cold at bay, but a symbol of warmth she had earned through her hard work and resilience. The warrior's words still echoed in her mind. "You are not alone. The land is vast, but the choices you make will shape the world around you." She had walked the path of survival for so long, but now, for the first time, she truly understood what he meant. She had learned to live with purpose, not just endure. She had faced her fears, accepted her strength, and embraced the life she had fought for. Her cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt like a home, a place where her spirit could rest and grow. The land, too, had become something more than just a battleground. It had become a partner in her journey. As the days passed, she found herself working with a new sense of intention. Her hands, once stiff and reluctant, now moved with confidence as she tended to the garden, mended fences, and took care of the animals. The life she had built with so much struggle now seemed to flow more naturally, like the river she had once feared. One morning, as the sun rose high over the horizon, the widow was out in the field, collecting herbs for the upcoming season. The air was crisp, the scent of wildflowers in the breeze. She worked quietly, content with the rhythm of the land and the peace that had settled over her heart. As she knelt to pick a handful of lavender, she heard a sound in the distance. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it grew louder. Hooves. The familiar sound made her heart race, and she stood up quickly, brushing the dirt from her hands. She looked toward the sound, and there, coming over the ridge, was the warrior. The sight of him, riding towards her once again, sent a surge of emotion through her. He had returned, just as he had said. As he drew closer, she could see the same strength in him, but there was something different, something softer, as if the journey had changed him in ways she couldn't yet understand. He dismounted slowly, his eyes locking with hers. "I knew you would be here," he said, his voice steady, but there was a warmth to it that wasn't there before. "The land called me back, but more than that, I knew you would be ready." The widow felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips. "I didn't expect this," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "I didn't expect you to come back." The warrior nodded, taking a step closer to her. "The path always leads us back to where we need to be," he said. "And I have learned that it is not just the land that calls to us. It is the people we encounter along the way. You have taught me something important, widow." She looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "What have I taught you?" she asked. He smiled, a rare and genuine smile that softened his usually stoic expression. "That strength is not just about survival. It is about living, about choosing to keep moving forward even when the road is uncertain. You have shown me that the hardest journey is not the one across the land, but the one within." His words sank deep into her soul. She had never thought of herself as a teacher, but now, standing in front of this warrior, she realized that the lessons she had learned had touched him, too. "I've learned a lot from you as well," she said, her voice steady. "More than I ever thought I could. You've shown me that I don't have to be afraid anymore." The warrior nodded, his eyes softening. "Fear is a part of life, widow, but it does not define us. How we face it, how we choose to move forward, that is what matters." He paused, then added, "You are not alone, and you never will be." The widow stood there, taking in his words, feeling the weight of them settle into her heart. For so long, she had believed that her journey was one she had to face alone. But now, with the warrior standing before her, she realized that she had never truly been alone. Not really. Not when the land, and the people who crossed her path, had shown her that there was always something, or someone, to lean on. "What now?" she asked softly, the question lingering between them. The warrior looked at her for a long moment, his gaze full of something she couldn't quite place. "Now, you continue walking your path. But this time, you walk it with someone who understands, who sees you for who you are." He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You have the strength to walk it alone, but you don't have to. I'll walk with you, if you'll allow it." The widow felt a sense of peace fill her, as if something that had been missing had finally clicked into place. She had built her life on her own strength, but now, standing before this man who had shown her another way, she realized that there was nothing wrong with walking alongside another. "I would be honored," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. The warrior smiled, his eyes warm and steady. "Then let us walk this path together." The two of them stood there, side by side, as the sun began to set behind the mountains. The land stretched out before them, vast and beautiful, a reminder that the journey was never truly finished. But as the widow stood there, with the warrior beside her, She knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The world was full of possibilities, and now, she was ready to embrace them all. Immerse yourself in the world of Western stories, where survival, strength, and connection to the land are key elements in every journey. Follow a widow's transformative path as she faces the challenges of life on the frontier. After the loss of her husband, she learns to embrace solitude, but soon realizes the importance of human connection through an unexpected encounter with a Comanche warrior. Through the trials and triumphs, she discovers that survival is not enough. It is about living with purpose and choosing to face the future with courage. This story delves into themes of independence, resilience, and the quiet strength that grows when one opens their heart to the possibility of help from others. As the widow navigates her life, learning from the harsh land and the people she encounters, the narrative unfolds with a deep exploration of the spirit of the West. The journey is not just about physical survival. It's about choosing to thrive in a world full of uncertainty. With each step, the widow learns valuable lessons, ultimately finding peace within herself and a newfound understanding of her strength. If you're a fan of powerful Western stories that explore emotional growth and self-discovery, this journey will captivate you. Discover the heart of the West and the unbreakable spirit that drives those who live in it. The lessons from this Western story will stay with you long after the journey ends, as they remind us that no one has to walk the hard road alone. In the end, every Western story tells of resilience, hope, and the connection between people and the land they call home.